From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump declares victory at the southern border as migrant encounters fall to lows not seen in years. Meantime, 4 sanctuary city mayors defend their policies this week at a hearing before the House Oversight Committee. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Kim Strassel. The sudden receding of the migrant crisis might be one of the biggest changes in the country's trajectory since the election, or should I say re-election, of Donald Trump in November of 2024. Migrant encounters way down. The official numbers only go through the month of January. And, of course, Trump took office more than midway through the month of January, but it is hard not to read that, at least to my eye, as a vindication for the Trump strategy of deterrence. But, Monet, interesting that there were 4 sanctuary city mayors testifying before the House this week and not exactly backing off from their city policies of welcoming, shielding migrants, including illegal immigrants, in their cities. Let's listen first to Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson.
I know there are myths about these laws, but we must not let mischaracterizations and fear-mongering obscure the reality that Chicago's crime rates are trending down. We still have a long way to go, but sensationalizing tragedy in the name of political expediency is not governing. It's grandstanding.
And here is New York Mayor Eric Adams.
I cannot have a city where parents are afraid to send their children to school or where children are sleeping on the streets, creating the potential for child exploitation and sex trafficking. If an undocumented person refuses to seek medical care until they have a medical emergency, our city's healthcare system will be strained. And if an undocumented individual witnesses a crime but is afraid to call 911 for fear of being turned over to federal authorities, criminals will roam free.
Monet, what do you make of this? And is this a potential political mistake for these mayors, do you think, even though their voter bases have historically been supportive of these policies, given how unpopular they became in the era of the Biden border crisis?
I think it's a deeply unpopular move, and that Democrats nationwide are going to pay a political price for these cities refusing to amend their stance with regard to their sanctuary policies. I think it's important to be clear about what we mean by sanctuary city here, because these mayors mean more than just this is a place where illegal immigrants are welcome, though they certainly mean that. Their own law enforcement is not going to ask anyone for their immigration status or make any attempt to report or deport them. They also mean more than they're going to allow them to access public services, although they also mean that. Illegal immigrants in these cities are able to apply for a whole bunch of benefits, not just shelter, but childcare and things of that kind. What we mean by sanctuary cities here is that they don't cooperate at all with federal law enforcement with regard to the deportation of criminal migrants. That means when they have illegal migrants in their own custody, they won't actively report them to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. If Immigration and Customs Enforcement discovers that there is an illegal migrant, say, in a prison in New York, they can issue a detainer request for that migrant, basically say, New York, we want you to hold on to this person so that even if you're not going to pass them over to us, once you release them, we're going to go pick them up. And New York reserves the right to say, actually, we're not going to do that. And so even for criminal migrants, people who they know have committed crimes in their jurisdictions, they are minimally cooperating with federal law enforcement. I think that that's become very unpopular in the United States with the pace of migration that we've seen over the past few years. There have been a lot of lurid stories of illegal migrants who had previously been in custody who committed serious crimes, most famously perhaps the murder of Laken Riley. And I think that these Democratic mayors, by not adjusting their policies to say we're going to be more cooperative with at least getting the very dangerous illegal migrants out of the country, are really showing that they are out of step with where the American people are.
One of the ways that the Trump administration is trying to fight back against these kind of sanctuary policies is through litigation. And the Justice Department recently filed a lawsuit against Illinois and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. And the argument here, Kim, is that those policies in Illinois and Chicago are impeding federal immigration enforcement efforts. But the difficulty here is that it is a balance. It is true that local officials under the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, are not allowed to get in the way of federal agents, including officers of immigration and custom enforcement. But there's also a doctrine at the Supreme Court called the anti-commandeering. And the idea is that states are also their own sovereign actors. And so the federal government is not allowed to order around state police, local officials. And so the difficulty with these kinds of lawsuits and past efforts at trying to override sanctuary city policies is, where is the line between a local official that is impeding federal enforcement efforts and a local official who is simply declining to help them? And one of the things that has been in dispute is these sanctuary cities have somebody in their local jail for some kind of crime, and they may know that that person is an illegal immigrant, and they let them go because they are not required under the law. Sometimes the law, in fact, bars them from telling federal agents and ICE when that person is scheduled to be released. And to my mind, Kim, that is a bad policy, because then the ICE agents, if they are going to go try to find that person, have to go out into the community, do raids, do door knocking in a way that is more dangerous to law enforcement potentially. On the other hand, it is not obvious to me, in at least some of these situations, that declining to share that release information with ICE is actually a violation of federal law in a way that can be remedied by a lawsuit.
Yeah, we're going to find out, because the Trump administration is determined to take what, as you note, has been this balancing act. And we have some very broad decisions that get into this that essentially do what Monet said. They have put together this side and this side approach to this, which is no federal law enforcement. Federal officials cannot order state officials around, tell them what they have to give them, etc. On the other hand, when the federal government announces that it is going to take some action, the state is not, in fact, meant to impede that. And we're getting more and more scenarios that look like that now that you finally have an administration that is determined to take positive action against, in particular, criminal illegal aliens. One example, in the recent hearing this week with the Oversight Committee, Denver Mayor Johnston was asked in particular about a situation in which the feds had informed local authorities they wanted to get a hold of a certain individual and asked them to give them a couple of days' notice. Instead, they were informed about an hour before it was taking place. They ended up having to grab this guy outside in a parking lot. He assaulted an agent. It was not a good situation. So essentially what's happening here is the Trump administration has filed this litigation asking the court to become even more clear about what scenarios count as impediment by local officials, what powers the federal government has to demand certain things, and when the state is going over the line. And that might involve looking at some of these laws that states have on the book, too, that, you have to have a certain amount of sympathy for local officials who are being pulled in two directions here, both federal and state law. And the court walked into this some, but it hasn't necessarily refined those views, and we'll probably get some more of that. There are other things that can be done in absence of that, including Congress perhaps acting to put more pressure on this. But the legal front is going to be the immediate battle.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Monet, the overall vibe shift in Washington, I think, extends to the question of illegal immigration and the border crisis. I took a look at the border encounter numbers that are published by Customs and Border Protection for migrants at the southwestern border, and it is almost a remarkable plateau. There's a flat COVID lull, and then President Biden comes into office. He reverses President Trump's policies, suggesting that the new administration finds them inhumane. They're going to be more nice about it. He puts a pause on most deportations for 100 days. And within a period of months, the encounters at the southern border are way up. And then over Biden's 3-4 years, they go up and down a little bit. Some of that is seasonal, hot months, cold months. Some of it is not. Some of it might be based on different policies. Finally, in the middle of 2024, under political pressure as the 2024 election is coming, he signed some executive orders to tighten his policies. That seemed to have helped some. The numbers go down a bit. But remarkably, the change continues, and there is a drop even after the 2024 November election in which Trump wins. And Monet, I can only think that that has to do with the messages of deterrence that President Trump is sending. And then remarkably, in the last week or so, New York City has said that it is going to stop doing migrant intake at the old Roosevelt Hotel in Midtown. This had been almost an emblem of the migrant crisis. The city says that over recent years, it has processed 173,000 migrants at that site. And the closure of it is almost a period, I guess, on this Biden non-enforcement era.
Well, first of all, yes, I think the Trump deterrent effect on new migrants entering the country is profound to behold. It makes me think back to 2012, of all things, when Mitt Romney was running for president. He famously said that he believed if enforcement was made stricter, a lot of illegal migrants in the country would self-deport. And he was pretty roundly mocked by the press and by a lot of Democrats for suggesting that people who had come into the country illegally would decide to leave voluntarily rather than the U.S. government having to round them up. But you've seen exactly that, particularly with people who haven't yet crossed the border under the new Trump administration. They know that they're going to face much more scrutiny if they come in. They'll have the chance of being deported. They'll have the chance of being turned around at the border, and many of them have dispersed voluntarily. But there are also reports of people inside the country actively planning to leave because they believe that it's only a matter of time until they could be swept up into a raid. And so they're deciding it makes more sense to actually exit the country rather than face U.S. law enforcement. And so I do think that despite the fact that Trump has mostly actually maintained the border policies that Biden imposed at the end of his presidency, people know that immigration enforcement has been dialed up considerably, and so many fewer people are attempting to come. And with regard to New York, I do think that they believe that there's not going to be nearly as strong of a flow of new migrants into their city. Of course, a lot of those were being bussed in by Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, people who cross the southern border and enter these border states being sent to different cities around the country, particularly sanctuary cities, in order to test their statement that they were willing to accept all migrants and bear that cost. I do think that it's going to be a long time before these migrants are really taken care of, and there's still going to be quite a lot of disorder in New York City and some of these other big cities. Even if the Roosevelt Hotel is no longer being used for that purpose, they're going to have to still find a lot of places to shelter and feed these migrants. But it is meaningful that they feel that they're in a position now to begin ramping down, and that's going to have a whole bunch of ripple effects for the budget in the city, and it's going to be a small boost to Mayor Adams in his quest for re-election.
The drop in these numbers at the border provided President Trump with one of his biggest applause lines in his speech to a joint session of Congress on Tuesday. Here's what he said. "The media and our friends in the Democratic Party kept saying we needed new legislation. We must have legislation to secure the border, but it turned out that all we really needed was a new president," unquote. And Kim, to some degree, fair enough. I grant the president the bragging rights there, given the numbers that we're seeing. On the other hand, you mentioned the prospect of legislation in Congress. And I do wonder whether there's still an argument for President Trump to take a lead on some of this, because it seems to me that the immigration laws have been broken for a long time in a whole host of ways. And even though the numbers are down now, there's no guarantee that they will stay that way. If you go back and look again at these figures for encounters at the southern border, there was a pretty big spike in May of 2019 during President Trump's first term. The White House was issuing statements on the border crisis. Remember, this was before President Biden took office. Trump was threatening tariffs on Mexico. Those were averted after he got a deal to expand the Remain in Mexico policy. And so we are still living under the same immigration laws that we had when that was a border crisis. We're still living under the same immigration laws when Biden had the border crisis. And maybe at some point there's a strong case that Congress should get together and fix the laws. And so there's no prospect then that this could happen again, either under President Trump over the next 4 years or under his successor, whoever that might be.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, here's a way to look at this. Donald Trump is absolutely right. We are right to think that an enormous amount of the numbers that are seen at the border are a factor of the way that the president approaches this question. And having a tougher attitude is definitely a deterrent. Absolutely. At the same time, what we have is the example of a very weak president with the opposite policies, exposing yet more of the problems of our existing immigration law while he was in office. And we learned a lot about those problems, in particular, the asylum standards that we currently have clearly are pretty wishy-washy, and they allow for a lot of circumstances that I don't think people ever envisioned people would be using asylum for. But because they are so broad, there has been a lot of ability for people to get in under them. They then wait in this country. We had, by some estimates, 8 million people come in under Biden. And as we well know, there is not enough immigration judges to deal with that backlog in those cases. Even if Donald Trump does make some progress on deportations, there are limits to what those are. A lot of people are sitting and waiting to have a hearing. Those are scheduled for years out. Giving the backlog, those are positions that need to be created by Congress, funded by Congress. So you can't just snap your fingers and suddenly have 1,000 new immigration judges. It doesn't work that way. And then, of course, there are any number of leftover issues with our immigration system that we've long known are a problem. There's an urgent need to deal with the dreamers we have in this country. We still have not come up with a legislative fix for that. And these constant executive bopping around orders to deal with their future really is no answer to that. There's a real pressure to one day set up a seasonal labor program. Migrant farm work, for instance, happens in the summer. Some sort of temporary visa status allows people to come in and go back, which is what a lot of folks want to do. And by the way, which our labor markets need. Obviously, a lot of discussion about H-1B visas and highly skilled tech entrepreneur workers, and if we have enough of them. Those are all things Congress were talking about at one point. The problem, Joe Biden completely poisoned the well for all of this. What bipartisan discussions had been happening stopped on a dime when he came into office and issued this ridiculous immigration package put forward that was essentially, hi, we Democrats will take 100% of what we want and 0% of what Republicans care about. It was spitting in the eye of the other side and that bipartisanship, and the resentment over that continues to this day. So if Donald Trump, let him take his victory lap on reduced numbers at the border. But at some point, if he wants this to hold for future administrations who might not have the get tough attitude he does, he'll need to lead on this and push Congress hard to come up with legislative fixes.